Good evening, this is John Milburn for Laws 11059, Statutory Interpretation. This is week 11, and this is our final Zoom session for the subject. Next week, you will be doing the briefing paper, and all the very best for those of you that are going to sit that briefing paper. Thank you also for those that have joined us week after week. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you. And we look forward to doing that tonight as well. All right, you would have noticed today that I provided you with a briefing paper statement. So a briefing paper is really a document that can serve a number of purposes. In this context, I'm going to ask you to prepare a response to a series of questions using, of course, your statutory interpretation skills. And I'm going to ask you to prepare an outline of submissions. An outline of submissions is essentially submissions to a court in support of an argument. And obviously, I'm looking to test your ability to advance arguments about statutory interpretation principles. So, even though you may spot many legal arguments that relate to substantive law, contract law, consumer law, family law, criminal law, whatever it might be, I'm not really interested in that substantive law. I'm interested really only in statutory interpretation principles. So I hope you can understand that distinction as to what I'm trying to get from you. As you would have seen from the briefing paper statement, obtaining an extension is really not preferred option. Unless you're absolutely desperate, don't apply. Try and do the paper. The paper should really only take you 4 or 5 hours at most to do, maybe a little longer if you're being diligent. You can spend all day or 2 days on it if you want, but it shouldn't take you that long. And I've been very generous in terms of the amount of time that I've given you to do this paper. More than 50 hours or so is it's a very extended period of time. Look, it won't happen again. You're probably the last group to get the benefit of anything more than 24 hours for a take-home paper. But by having that extra time, it means that your opportunity to apply for an extension is so much less. So really just do the paper and make the most of the opportunity. Are there any questions before I go further? All good? All right. The paper is one where you can consult with others. Use your discretion. Bear in mind the rules against collusion, and what you produce must be your own work. I've set out the rubric, and you can see that in the statement. All right, in terms of what you might expect in the paper, the take-home paper, the first thing is that I will release it on, I think, Wednesday. You have to have it in on Friday at 11:45 p.m. Be careful about submitting it late because there may be a rush on and Moodle may crash. So bearing in mind that it's got to be submitted by that time, be prepared to submit a little earlier if you can. Okay, so it's statutory interpretation. So it will come as no surprise that the task involves interpreting a statute. The task will be a factual scenario which is hypothetical. In many ways, it will be a task that's very similar to the task that you had previously in relation to the firefighters. It may be actual legislation that you're dealing with, or it may be hypothetical legislation that you're dealing with. But your task will be to interpret legislation with respect to a factual scenario. So no surprises there. The legislation may be state or it may be federal. It might be delegated legislation. So it'll be some sort of legislation that you need to interpret. You won't have to go looking for the legislation particularly, unless it's real legislation, in which case you can actually look at the Act itself. But I'll guide you as to what legislation, real or hypothetical, I require you to consider within the factual circumstance. One tip is, if you're looking for any guidance from the textbook, I would suggest it's this. Have a look at the flowchart diagram. It's challenging, but it's comprehensive, and it's referred to a couple of times in the textbook, but the easiest way to find it, just have a look at the inside back cover. Beyond that, I'm going to be difficult and not give you specific reference to information in the text. The text isn't all that long. It's not that difficult to read. So for preparing for the exam, I would have expected that you would read all of the text, certainly the parts that we've dealt with in class that are specifically required as part of the reading. But have a look at that flow diagram on the inside back cover and understand that, and be ready to apply that in the context of the factual scenario. All right. Feel free to jump in with a question or comment at any stage, otherwise I'll just keep talking. When we're structuring an answer to a question like this, we need to consider a few different tactics. And I guess the tactic is to have something in mind where you're logically considering the process. When it comes to statutory interpretation, what's the first phase, if I can use that term, that we need to consider in the context of any facts? What's the first phase? Leonie says identification. Hard to argue against that. That's exactly right. Okay, so what do we mean by Ernest says relevance, yeah. So what do we mean by the identification phase? What does that actually mean? And my internet connection is unstable again. All right, does anyone want to unmute the microphone and tell me what the identification phase means? What does it require us to do?
To ask questions and find out what happened, like the facts of what you're trying to, and what the person actually wants to achieve out of it.
Yeah, okay. So interrogate the circumstances, says Alan. Yep. Sharon says find out what we're trying to achieve. Yes, Leonie?
I was going to say whether or not the legislation actually applies for where the person is.
Yeah, I think all of those things are right. I think probably, I like your response there, Leonie, in particular, in that we really want to know this question, an answer to this question. Does the Act apply in the current factual circumstances? So to take a silly example, if we're dealing with a straightforward debt situation, it's unlikely that you'll be raising issues to do with the, who knows, Vegetation Management Act if you're pursuing a debt for unpaid credit cards. Do you understand what I mean? So does the Act apply in the current factual circumstances? That's kind of a threshold question. In order to answer that question, yeah, what Sharon and Alan said is right. You need to interrogate, you need to look at the circumstances. So you need to have a match. And that's really, I think, what we mean by this identification phase. All right. So, yes, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add to that also, when you're reading the scenarios, to also take out the information that isn't necessary in order to actually come to an answer, so that it's not as overwhelming looking at all the wording.
That's good, Angelina. Extracting what is relevant is really important, and it's not easy to do because you can become blinded by the circumstances, and something that might be seem to be important may not necessarily be important. So thank you, Angelina. That's good. Does anyone else wish to make any comments about the identification phase? Vivian says, identify what the provision says and what I think the operative provision means. Yep, so you're matching the two. That's good. Any other questions or comments about the identification phase? All good? All right. Once you've worked out, let's say, that the Act does apply in the current factual circumstances, be prepared to support your answer as to why that's the case. And then you need to identify whether a certain section or a division or a part applies. And remember, of course, that when we're looking at statutory interpretation, context is so important. And the immediate context is, if we think section 27 applies, we should look at that division in total, which incorporates section 27. So division 3 of the Act, let's say, may contain sections 22 to 36 inclusive. So don't just read section 27. Definitely have a look at 33 or 23 to 36 as that division, because there might be an interpretation section about how to interpret words within that division. That might be section 23. So that could have an absolute direct bearing on section 27. So it's a big mistake just to look at the individual section, expand and look at that context. And also, here's a little trick. Make sure that the division was in force at the time of the factual scenario under consideration. Look, it might be obvious. It may be obvious that none of the Act applied at that time. But bear in mind that sometimes certain parts of legislation come into effect at different times to others. So you can fall into a trap of thinking, well, this Act is 1999, this event occurred in 2015, it must have been in effect. It probably was, but it may have been that a certain part only came into effect later. How do we find out when certain parts of legislation have come into effect? Where do we look?
Can I check the Hansard for that?
Okay.
Or somewhere easier?
Yeah. Now, I'm just trying to identify who I think Angelina said something. Who else was speaking? Sorry, I just couldn't quite catch it.
That was me. Sorry, John.
Okay. So you'll need to identify where to look. Parliamentary sites, says Alan. Yep. History of amendments, says Jay. So amendments at the end of the Act. Yep. I want you to think about that. And even if it is covered, even if the Act does apply, for a good answer, I want you to tell me that it applies and tell me how you found out that it applies. So leave that as part of your research, okay? If you have any problems, let's ask and have a chat through UCrew. We can have a chat before the paper's released. After that, I won't be involved in any chats. All right, so in the identification phase, we need to determine whether the Act applies in the factual circumstances, and we need to ensure that that Act, or at least the relevant part of the Act, was in effect. And we need to check those points and almost check them off. Yes, yes, okay. Once we get through the identification phase, what's the second phase? No takers? Oh, now we've got one here.
Exploration.
Exploration. Alan, yes, we've got explanation from Leonie and
Apparently.
Alan says identify the legal issues to be addressed. Look, I'm going to go with the identification of the legal issues. It is the explanation phrase, but we really need to consider the operative provisions is one thing that I bypass. So I think that's what Alan's getting at. So before we get on to exploration phase, just bear in mind that there may be some operative provisions that apply in those current circumstances. All right. So exploration phase, what's all that about? What's the exploration phase? What are we trying to do? All right, we're looking at purpose and context. Yep. Find out which rules apply. Yep. That's from Leonie and Alan respectively. Thank you. Any other thoughts? What's involved in the exploration phase? All right, so obviously we're trying to identify extrinsic materials is a common answer. Leonie and Jay, what's the object of the Act? Vivian, extrinsic materials. All right, so we want to consider statutory interpretation principles. That's pretty obvious. I would have thought that we need to consider the ordinary meaning of the words. Sometimes that's overlooked. And, you know, we're going to look at what the ordinary meaning is, but also, as has been consider the broader context. And to consider that broader context, we need to do, as has been suggested by a number of you, consider the extrinsic materials. Jay says consider the object of the Act. Yep, I agree with all that. So we need to consider the intrinsic materials and the extrinsic materials when determining the context and purpose of the legislation. And we do that to consider the broader context, but don't ignore the ordinary meaning of the words. Oh, that's very complicated. It's not meant to be that complicated. But have a list for yourself, have a checklist for yourself that you can work through and identify as part of your legal reasoning. All right. Once we've gone through that once we've gone through the identification stage and the exploration stage, what's the final thing that we need to do? What's the final stage? Application. Apply it, application. Spot on. Double thumbs up. All right. I'll give you a hint. This is where most of the work is to be done. In the take-home exam, I have specifically said, I'm not giving individual marks for individual questions. I want you to work out where the emphasis should be. But I have asked you to prepare an outline of submissions to a court, which is really the application phase. Won't take you long to work out that that's really important. There was a question about the flow chart. Where is it? Yeah, back page, inside of the text. Inside back page of the text. Thank you, Leona and Angelina.
John,
Okay, so yes.
just quickly, John. How big should our outline of submissions be roughly? Do you think?
Overall, you've got 2,000 words, I think. And I'm going to be real nuisance here and just say that you can use whatever number of words you think is appropriate. Sorry. I think it was 2,000 that I said, wasn't it? Does anyone disagree that I said 2,000 words as the total? That's what we said? Okay.
No, 2,000, yeah.
2,000, all right. Correct. Okay. So use the 2,000 words in the best way that you think fit. If you think that all of that should be included in the outline of submissions, fine. Whatever you think. Sorry, Dakota. Not very helpful answer, was it? Any other questions? I'll try to be more helpful.
John, can I just ask a question? Is there a set format, or are we sort of at liberty to do whatever we've done in the previous 2 assessments.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of personal style comes into this, Leonie, and as a result of that, I don't like to be too prescriptive in terms of a formula, but I do like you to think logically through the process. And by thinking logically through the process, you probably end up with a formulaic manner to some degree. I hope that answers your question. Okay. All right. So an outline of submissions to a court is a formal document where you are attempting to persuade the court to accept your version of the legal situation as it applies to the factual circumstances. So that's what the application phase is all about. I'm interested in how you apply statutory interpretation principles in this hypothetical real-life scenario. And I'm not interested in other substantive parts of the law, only the statutory interpretation principles. So what that means is that you'll be talking about the same sorts of things that you talked about in the previous assessment, I should think. In that way, this assessment is a little easier than it might have otherwise been. Is there an outline of submission shown in the text, or do we Google it? That's a really good question. Look, there is a sort of form that you can use. I think court forms, if you go on the court's website, there might be an outline of submissions, but it really is quite simple. It's normally just outline of submissions, numbered paragraphs, quite well spaced. It's not all squashed up, so good spacing. So it's easy for the judge to read, in this case me, and what you're attempting to do is persuade. So use all of your persuasive writing skills. You know I like short sentences. You know I like it to be relevant to the point. And as a result of that, you'd probably have quite regular stops and quite regular paragraphs. Better to have more paragraphs enumerated than less, I should think, as a general rule. So there's no prescribed form that I want you to follow, but you can have a look on the court's website and that might give you a guide. Or yeah, Google it. Get an idea that way. Any other questions? It's only a short session tonight for our final session. You'll be pleased to hear. All good? All right. I will say this, that in the exam for the outline of submissions, there is there's a bit of a choice, but not much of a choice, but a bit of a choice. Okay. All right. Well, that's it for this course. Thank you very much for your attendance. I need to ask a favour. I'm still short on feedback numbers. I need, I think, another 6 or so. So if you know someone that hasn't put in some feedback, please encourage them. I need it for me and for the university. Thank you very much. Okay, well, unless there's any questions or comments, I'll wrap it up. And I thank you very much for attending. And good luck next week. I'm sure you'll all do very well. Okay, all the best. Bye.